Hey, what is going on, guys? Philip here from TCG Madness, bringing you guys another Altered TCG gameplay, and today I will be showing off the purple deck, Yasmir, the Akesha deck, the deck that I personally think is the most overpowered deck of the 6 starters that you have in Altered TCG. You guys like the first gameplay so much, so bringing you guys another video. Again, if you guys like this, want to see more of this, please hit that like button, comment down below. If you're new, consider hitting that subscribe button. If you want to back Altered TCG, which is still currently up on Kickstarter, I will leave a link down below in the description box. If you want to learn how to play a full ultimate on how to play guide, I will leave a link down below to a channel called Main Deck. That guy does an amazing job on how to play this game. Really easy to understand and dissect. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and dive right into the gameplay as I voice over and do the step-by-step. If you didn't see the first video, there'll be a link down below to that as well. In the first battle, I actually played against this deck, and I actually was fortunate enough to beat it. I actually know how to actually counter this deck somewhat. If you play this deck right, you almost cannot lose with this deck. This deck is unbelievable. It has the ultimate removal, and there's nothing countering removal right now in the first phase of Altered TCG, at least not in the starter decks, that's for sure. Whether or not we get counters to these removal spells, that'll be determined when we actually get our hands on the product and actually get booster boxes. So you guys remember 3 cards into mana. That's how we start off. This deck is all about just removing pretty much the commander or the leader of this deck. All it wants to do is just tap it, and it forces your opponent to go first. Going first with this deck is unbelievably good because ultimately what you want to do with this deck is you want your opponent to go first, and all you want to do is just counter everything your opponent does. You will see in this entire gameplay, that's exactly what I do throughout the entire game. All I do is just counter my opponent over and over and over again. The deck I'm playing against is the pink deck. It's a very fun deck, but I don't think it's one of the better decks. It pretty much relies on a lot of dice rolling, so it's pretty much a gamble, high risk, high reward type of deck. I just don't think there's enough pieces currently for this deck. So therefore, I just don't think it's just that good at the moment. Again, when we get booster boxes and stuff like that, we'll see how well the other cards that are in that deck. So, of course, my opponent plays a card on the left side. I'll play a card on the right side on my companion side. So this way we both evenly swap. First move of the game, really not that big of a deal. He's going to advance on the hero side. I'll just advance on the companion side. I'm good with that. I'm pretty sure he's going to tap his leader so he can use the dice roll ability, which is what that leader does. It has certain abilities. If you roll like a 1 through 3, it does this. If you roll a 4 or 5, it does this. And if you roll a 6, you get this. Again, high risk. You can see it right there on the card. Those are all the abilities it does. Here comes the dice roll. It gets a 2, which I think that means it gets a +1 on it. Yep, there it is, which is, not a big deal. It's the first turn of the game. We don't really care about that. And you'll see, too, this is not a very good matchup, the purple versus pink. Just not a good matchup because all that dice rolling is going to be absolutely worthless when you're bouncing your opponents, which I already have a Dorothy Gale, which if, Dorothy Gale is the OP person in this deck, you play her, you bounce something. So like I said, hero advance, companion advance, nothing new under the sun there. And now we're going to move on to our next turn. Cards go into reserved. It's a new day. I get the token to go first. I'm going to draw some cards, and we're going to easily put a card into the mana. I draw a Baba Yaga, which I like this card a lot because Baba Yaga allows me to draw a card. I also got a Spycraft, and I also have a 1/1 and a Dorothy Gale. You definitely want that 1/1 to go into the reserved. That little studious disciple. It's a 1/1, very cheap, but the good thing about that is once you get it in its reserve, you can actually remove it from your reserve, and the next spell you play cost 1 less, which I really like. So essentially you can get Dorothy Gale out for 4, you can get Baba Yaga out, like stuff like that. You can basically reduce its cost by 1, so you definitely want that. So of course I used my hero's ability right immediately. It's usually what I do 9 times out of 10. I'm just going to use my hero's ability, and I'm just going to pass the turn right to my opponent because of course this deck wants to counter everything your opponent does. So by making your opponent goes first, it's going to easily tell me what I should play. So my opponent now is thinking what they're going to do here. They eventually will play a card, and I'm probably going to play both Baba Yaga and the Studious Disciple. Baba Yaga I'll be able to draw a card off of, and the Studious Disciple is good to get in my reserve. So they played something, didn't really do much, and now I'm looking at, okay, they only have 1 mana left. This should be an easy advance on both sides. So like I said, here comes Baba Yaga out. We're going to play it on the hero side. We're going to draw ourselves a card. Pretty good card there. I like that one as well. He's a 3/1. Cost 3, also gets +2, or +2 to all his abilities in each zone, and then he can come into your reserve for 1. So he's a pretty cheap card to play out of your reserve for 1. And then, of course, my opponent, if they don't have a 1-drop, they're basically just going to pass, which they do. And then I'm going to play my Studious Disciple on the companion side, and now I'm going to be able to allow my hero and my companion advance, getting me 1 step closer to victory. You can see this deck already. It has a very good, I call, mana curve. The cards in here, a lot of 2s, 3s, and a good amount of 1-drops as well, with Dorothy Gale being the 5-drop. So there's a lot of good cards in here that you can play every turn. So we remove Baba Yaga from the reserve, because I don't want Baba Yaga in there clouding up my reserve. I'd rather keep the other chick and the Studious Disciple, because the 3/3 is pretty good abilities. Baba Yaga comes out for 2, but Baba Yaga's kind of weak. So we ended up drawing another Dorothy Gale, which is excellent, because you want as many of her in your hand as possible, because you just want to continuously remove things. I do have 2 Alchemidas, so I'm going to go ahead and remove one of them and keep my Dorothy Gales. And here's where the fun basically begins. Now at this point, every time he plays something, I'm just going to remove it. So my opponent is thinking, I'm kind of hoping he plays a big creature, and he does, which is unbelievably silly. I'm guessing he's never played against this deck. The way to actually beat this deck is to just absolutely crowd the field as much as possible with cheap creatures. He played something for 5, which was, again, silly. Even though it has anchored, it's not going to make 1 bit of difference. So we're just going to go ahead and play Dorothy Gale, and we're going to go ahead and remove him, and we'll advance on the companion side. So there it is, easy move to play here. Play Dorothy Gale, remove your opponent's creature, which is what I do. It goes right to the reserve. And now you're seeing why this deck is so frustrating. So even though it had anchored, it gets removed, and there's nothing to counter that. So then I'm going to pass. He's going to pass because he's got absolutely no mana. It doesn't make 1 bit of difference what he plays. And now my companion advances. And now you can see my opponent is so far behind the 8 ball. It's already looking like this is going to be a quick and decisive victory. So now, of course, Dorothy Gale goes into my reserve, and I have a choice to make. Do I get rid of Alice, my Studious Disciple, or my Dorothy Gale? I already have another Dorothy Gale in my hand, and Alice actually has better abilities or better stats than Dorothy Gale. So I'm actually going to remove Dorothy Gale from my reserve, knowing that I have another one in my hand. And look at that, we just drew the best Dorothy Gale. Now this Dorothy Gale is unbelievable. It's a 5/5 with the same stats, the 3/2/2s, but anytime you play it out of your hand or your reserve, you're going to bounce something from your opponent's board. That Dorothy Gale is unbelievably strong. It's the best one to pull. That's the one you're looking for. So I'll go ahead and get rid of the other Dorothy Gale, put it in the mana pool. I already got Off You Go as well. So I have cards across the board here to bounce. And I'm going to go first, which means I'm going to force my opponent actually to go first. Going first with this deck is great. Like I said, you're going to always pass to your opponent, so you force your opponent to make the decisions, so then you basically counter those decisions. As long as you have the cards to counter everything your opponent plays, you're going to win 9 times out of 10 with this deck. It's a very strong deck. So, like I said, there I go. I already tapped my hero to make my opponent go first, and I'm just going to dictate all my moves based on what my opponent plays. So again, you're usually hoping for your opponent to play big, strong creatures, and then basically you just counter those creatures. That's all you got to do. And once again, he put a 3-drop, so I believe this is the time where I play the Studious Disciple. You get rid of the Studious Disciple, you play Off You Go for 1, you bounce that, and then pretty much you can force your opponent, which is exactly what I think I do on this turn. Yep, so there you go. You're going to see it. I'm going to go ahead and use my Studious Disciple's ability to get rid of it from my reserve, and the next card I play costs 1 less. So Off You Go is going to cost me 1, and we're going to go ahead and bounce that 3/3 right on out of here. Into the reserve you go. Just like that, my opponent has been countered, and now my opponent has to go again, and if he plays anything for 3 mana, I know that my opponent has nothing else to play, which means that I can play, there we go. We can play Dorothy Gale here right now and bounce that if we wanted to. So everything you do just infuriates your opponent. There's nothing to counter these type of counters. There needs to be something, or the ability anchored should be that it can't get removed either. So there you have it. We're going to play Dorothy Gale on the companion side, and that is once again going to remove the opponent's companion side with 0 mana once again, which means my opponent can't do anything. It doesn't matter what he does. So we'll play Dorothy Gale on the companion side. We'll bounce the companion creature. And also to what that does, it's going to force my opponent to make a decision because that card immediately goes to the reserved. So now my companion will advance without anything on my opponent's side, hero or companion advancing, and it forces my opponent to make a decision on what to do with all of these cards in the reserved. So now you're seeing this deck in full effect. This deck actually has what I call some really good combo pieces. Most of these starter decks don't have a lot of good combo pieces. This deck I think actually runs very well. It's very fluid. It has a good mana curve, so some cheap cards, some 2s, 3s, and 1-drops, and of course ways to actually cheat cards out with the Studious Disciple. Everything in this deck to me feels like it has a purpose. There's nothing clouding this deck. There's nothing, making it in bunches. There's not too many of one thing. Everything is just well put together. It's why I think this deck is the best deck, and the hero for this deck is the best it could be. It literally forces your opponent to go first, and now your opponent, you're just dictating everything your opponent does. Every time your opponent does something, you just counter it. As long as you can counter what your opponent is doing, you're going to win 9 times out of 10. So there you have it. That's why this deck is just so strong, and you're seeing it in its full effect. So here we go. We ended up getting a Lady of the Lake, which, okay, but I'd rather just keep playing all my counters. I'll put Lady of the Lake into the mana, which is what I do here. And you can see once again I have another Off You Go, which is perfect. And we also have Dorothy Gale, so we have 7 mana, so we can essentially play Dorothy Gale and Off You Go if I wanted to. We also have the Alchematus as well we can play for 3, and we can play the Off You Go into the reserved as well, and that will also force my opponent to make a tough decision as it will have too many cards into the reserve. Or, essentially, you can also play Dorothy Gale again. So here I go. We're going to go ahead and pick up, and at this point too, when I'm getting down to this very close to winning, what you want to do is you just want to focus on one side for the rest of the game. Either you're focusing on your hero side or you're focusing on your companion side. If your opponent goes first and puts something on the companion side, we'll just go ahead and play something on the hero side and force your opponent to either deal with it or essentially just allow me to advance and get one step closer to winning. So we're going to go ahead and play the Alchematus on the hero side, and you're going to see this card is pretty good as well. It's a 3-drop, but when you play it, it gets +2 to all its zone abilities. So now we have 3/3/3 on the left side, and now my opponent is forced to play its last card in hand. And this is something you guys want to pay attention to. When you have no cards in your hand, it's a very dangerous spot to be in, because all the cards you now played go into your reserve. All those cards into your reserved have to get reduced down to 2. So you're going to see he's going to have 4 cards in his reserved, and he has no cards in his hand, or her hand. I don't know, male or female here. We'll just say my opponent for the rest of the game. You're going to see my opponent now has a lot of cards in reserved and no cards in hand. Essentially now I know everything my opponent is going to play and do, and this is a bad spot to be. Even if you're not playing against a deck like this, you never want to have no cards in hand. You always want to have end the day with 1 or 2 cards in hand. Having no cards in hand, not a good place to be. It's essentially you're showing your opponent what you're going to play now, because you can see everything in their reserve. There's nothing hiding. So now he's going to play another card out of his reserve to try and make sure he's got fleeting, and to ultimately advance on the companion side while I advance on the hero side with just 1 card. That's all you got to do, guys. Counter your opponent, play something that your opponent doesn't play on one side and just advance one of the characters. All you have to do is just stop your opponent once or twice in a game with this deck, and essentially you will win. As you can see, I am so far ahead. So the Alchematus goes into reserved, and now my opponent has to discard 2 of those cards from the reserve to the discard pile. He's got too many. And again, that's not a good place to be in, especially when you're playing against this deck. This deck bounces everything to the reserve, and there are cards that will take your cards from your reserve and put it right into your discard pile. So there you go. Opponent now discards 2 cards, and now he has a 5-drop and a 2-drop in his reserved with only 2 cards in hand. One of them has to go into mint. Well, doesn't have to, but essentially he will if he wants to play more cards. We ended up drawing 2 cards that were really good, Spycraft and this guy, but too high of a mana value cost, so we'll just go ahead and discard him and put him in the mana side. So now we have 8 mana to work with. My opponent ended up passing on the mana, which, again, that's what I'm saying. You don't want to have 0 cards in hand, because that's what it's going to force you to do. So you guys are going to see I'm going to play Spycraft, which is a great card. It will take 1 card from your opponent's reserved and immediately put it into the discard, and you're going to take the top card of your deck and put it into your reserved, and we ended up getting the Studious Disciple, which was good because you can discard your Studious Disciple into your reserved and cheat out the next card for 1 less. And now you guys are seeing that this deck has an engine. You're seeing the engine actually running here. Everything is comboing off, everything is going off the way it's supposed to go, and essentially the game is over. So now once again, I'm going to tap my hero to force my opponent to go again, because this way I want to see if my opponent will empty that last card in his or her hand, which I believe they do, which was once again not a good idea because, you know, now you're showing me that you have nothing in your hand. So you can see my opponent is thinking, I would have played something out of my reserve, but I'm pretty sure, I'm like 99% sure my opponent plays that last card, and there you go, last card from hand down to the field, and he played it on the wrong side as well. You can see the opponent played it on the companion side. I would have played 1 card on the hero side, but it really doesn't matter what it does because whatever my opponent does, I had every combo to pretty much counter it. So we played Dorothy Gale, which is, again, it's going to bounce another thing from the companion side into my opponent's reserved, and now my opponent has no cards and 3 cards in reserved. So it doesn't matter what they do. If they played anything on the hero side, I had the Studious Disciple I could have discarded and played Off You Go for 1. But if they don't play anything, I can always play the last Alchemist on the left side to just buff up all of my zones. And you guys can see I'm typing GG here because it's good game. It's over. I already know it's over. I'm pretty sure my opponent knows it's over as well. And that's just going to be game. So you can see now how good this deck is. Comment down below if you guys think this is one of the best decks, especially because there's no counters to these counters. There's nothing to say, oh, if your opponent, you know, is going to bounce something, you know, there's just nothing stopping from me from doing that to my opponents. That's why I think this deck is one of the best. There's nothing to counter these counters. At least to my knowledge, there isn't. Every time I played against this deck in these beta tests, I always lost against this deck. This was, to me, the best deck of all the 6. If you were to get just one deck, I highly recommend getting this deck. If you like deck that pulls off a lot of shenanigans, this is the deck to go. So you can see my opponent's trying to do a bunch of things that none of this matters. It's game over. My opponent pretty much knows that they only have 2 mana left to play anyways. It doesn't matter what they play. They play something on the hero side, I can bounce it. They play something on the companion side, it won't matter because I'll win automatically on the hero side, which is what they do. They accept defeat, and we'll just go ahead and play the Alchematus on the left side just to go ahead and use that 1 last mana, and then both of us will pass, and that's turn. We have 0 mana on both sides. So there's nothing to do besides pass, and then my opponent will hopefully pass as well here soon, and you will see that the hero advances on my side, the companion will advance on his side, my hero and my companion will meet, which is how you win this game, if they decide to pass anytime today. There's really nothing else to do. He already tapped down his hero, he's got no mana, no cards, it doesn't matter. There you go, we're both going to pass. And now the hero for me advances, the companion for my opponent advances, and that is game. Once again, if you guys like this type of content, hit that like button, subscribe if you're new. If you want to check out Altered TCG, go check out their Kickstarter page. Thanks for watching, guys.